On the subject of missiles, there's an excellent question from the audience, last row, left side, Marvin D. Resnick.
When we had détente and the Russians withdrew militarily, we kept our missiles in Europe, ostensibly to be directed at the Middle East, supposedly. And I'm wondering if that didn't turn Putin into a cynic who said, well, I can't trust the United States that they're going to keep their missiles there, and that set him off on a, shall I say, a right-wing course.
I think it's very interesting in this context to look at the American missile defense bases which are planned for Poland and the Czech Republic and have been very controversial there. So let's wrap that together. And let me put that to Claudia Rosett. Do you think that how justified is Putin in seeing, after NATO expansion, when Russia was promised that there would be no big NATO bases in the former Warsaw Pact countries, and now here we are building two quite important ones. Aren't the Russians justified in feeling a little bit antsy about this, a little bit paranoid?
Could we back up here for a minute? When the Russian government came in, building on the debris of the Soviet Union, and in many ways it is the same Russia. In fact, the basic framework for many things is the same Russia. They had an enormous challenge ahead where the great hope was that they would build a genuine democratic state, and that required great concentration on internal reforms. And more, what we've been listening to is a focus on external enemies, on ways of avoiding that kind of actually dealing inside. What you got instead was this criminal state which is going to basically take anything that's convenient and use it for a sort of rallying point. So should he be concerned? We're not about to attack Russia. And I don't think that we're arguing here this evening that Russia is about to physically attack the United States. We're not worried that with their military budget they're going to launch missiles that will hit New York next week. What we're worried about is that they have become a force that is antagonistic, or they are becoming increasingly antagonistic to our interests. And could I just suggest that this is not only military. On the diplomatic front, if you follow the United Nations, Russia is over and over again at loggerheads with everything that is in the U.S. interests, both in the debate that's gone on in Iran, in the effort to enforce sanctions on Iraq. They were the #1 cheaters, have done nothing about that. There's been no investigation, nothing. Well, we have federal prosecutions here into people who did dirty deals. And if you go to things like the Human Rights Council, you will find Russia in its votes lining up squarely with countries that I think you can reasonably call enemies of the United States. They line up with Iran, with Cuba, with Sudan, with Syria, with countries that are very much opposed to the U.S. interests. It's that kind of growing, sort of that trend that we're talking about tonight.
Mark Medish, against the motion. Do you want to come back on that?
If we were sitting in Moscow, we would hear from people there a long bill of particulars about how they feel that Russia has been slighted in the post-Cold War period, how the U.S. Advanced its interests in an unconsultative manner against Russia's interests. And you named one area of the forward basing of missiles, the NATO enlargement, which the U.S. had actually promised to rule out during the process of German reunification, but that went forward. I think it's good that it did, but it irritated the Russians. The unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty by the Bush administration in its first months in office. That angered the Russians. It annoyed them, the unilateralism of it in particular. So there's a long list on that side as well. We have a list. We need to cut through this. We need to cut through this because these bills of particulars don't actually add up to a hostile enemy relationship. We need to bear in mind in America that other countries are allowed to have national security interests as well. And they're allowed to interpret those themselves. And they won't always line up perfectly. There will be friction. And we've got to work out issues that are at the tension points. And missile defense is a great example that Ed brought up. The U.S. has a bold concept of missile defense. Well, not everybody in the world is comfortable with it, including amongst our European allies. And the Russians have problems with it, or claim to have problems with it. I think what Secretary Rice and Secretary Gates did in Moscow a couple of weeks ago was actually quite productive. They went there and they listened to the Russian views as to how this project could perhaps be done better in a cooperative manner. And I think they've made some progress in that regard. And so I commend the Bush administration for opening its ears and trying to avoid the self-fulfilling prophecy of believing the rhetoric. And by gosh, there's a lot of rhetoric out there.
Well, let me just follow up on that with another question to the people opposing the motion. That there's, I think, a consensus here that the mood in Russia is quite anti-Western, and a lot of the propaganda or stance taken by the media in Russia stokes this up. We heard about textbooks, it's in the media as well. I'd like to ask Nina Khrushcheva, who's speaking against the motion, isn't there a danger that people actually start believing this?
Absolutely. There is always a danger with propaganda. It could be successful or unsuccessful, and Putin's propaganda is incredibly successful because, as you know, not only that he has tough stance on America, sometimes on international debate, but he also walks around half naked in Siberia, showing off his abs. I mean, and this is the most successful propaganda you can have. All of a sudden, Russia has a president that is better than James Bond. I mean, that is a very powerful message. And in fact, I think this message is also created because, as I think Bob mentioned, the military exercises, threatening as they may look, in fact, they're not really going that well. And we also know that Russia's technology, or at least implementation of service, is no longer what it was during the Soviet period, when the training was good, in fact excellent. Now it's sort of all over the place, so they may come up with some latest technology, but they have no idea how to service it. I mean, you know, let's face it, even KGB now has the third-rate people there. So there is a certain danger that it could happen. But, you know, I'm the only Russian here, so I can speak from experience. Russians are only gullible to a certain extent. And when they really realize, because so far the words actually kind of correspond, whatever they want to believe, but the minute it stops happening, I can assure you, dissidentship will come back as it was in the 50s and 60s, or we've never seen before.
Very briefly, Bret Stephens, do you want to come back on that?
On a couple of points. First of all, to Nina's point, incompetence is not intention. If the Russians are building brand new nuclear missile submarines, which is I would say, a bizarre project given the shambles of their regular forces and what their needs are. The fact that they're not building them well, or the sea trials aren't going well, doesn't address the basic point, which is that this is what they intend to do. So that's a point that needs to be made. There's one other point I'd like to make, if I can.
15 seconds, if you can squeeze it in.
Well, it's an issue that someone here needs to address, which is, yes, the United States and Russia ought to have common interests, and yet, strangely, the Russians seem to work at cross purposes with what we would say at this table are their basic interests. Why are they building a nuclear reactor at Bushehr, which Mr. Putin just said he is ready to complete, which in a period of about 15 months will create 330 kilograms of spent fuel, which can easily be reprocessed into about 50 to 60 Nagasaki-type bombs? Is that the Russian interest?